When you'd rather write it down and give it to a board member to ask the question, we do have forms on the table for that as well. So with no further ado, I will introduce our city staff here. Our presentation is on the Housing and Design Initiative, which is continuing the city's work on Springfield housing strategy, while helping also the city come into compliance with the state housing related statutes and rules. Many folks know there's several of those passed in recent years. The city is focused particularly on attention on amending the Springfield Development Code to include clear and objective standards for mixed use areas. This approach will reduce regulatory barriers by allowing more types of housing in commercial and mixed areas, and continue the larger ongoing development code update projects to simplify our code language and streamline the development process. So this is all tied together to help several of our initiatives. Today we have Haley Campbell. She is the senior planner with City of Springfield and the project manager for the Housing Plus Initiative Design Initiative project. Come on in, sit down. Don't be bashful. Her work focuses on connection between long-range land use planning efforts and how the development code makes the long-term direction and goals a reality, which so far has resulted in amendments for stormwater management, income qualified housing, and annexation requirements. Joining her is Monica Slather. She's a comprehensive planner, which her efforts touch on varied aspects of the community development and their programs, including securing grants for land use and transportation projects, updating Springfield's natural resource studies, working with Lama Lane Park and Recreation District, advancing mapping projects, and more. Monica's current focus is to apply policies in ways that make technical information interesting and easy to access. She helps the planning group with a lot of their community engagement efforts around projects. So Haley and Monica have been working together on outreach projects, these posters and other things to get feedback from community members on the project. We also have Sandy Belson here, who's the comprehensive planning manager. So when we get to the question section, if there's questions or additional details, she may jump in and add information from the manager perspective. So with no further ado, I'll introduce or have Haley come up and start the presentation.
Okay. Maybe I'll just speak up. So if anybody can't hear me, feel free to chime in and just be like, I can't hear you. So I might try to extend my voice a little bit. Thank you all for being here today. So today, it's a presentation on this project to introduce you to what we're working on. And you'll briefly be hearing from Monica about halfway through the presentation, and then I'll take it back over. So Glenn, would you go to the next slide, please?
You should
We have to do it. We got this. All right. So today's agenda, it includes a discussion on exploring the allowances for more housing in our commercial and mixed use districts. The first part will provide a context or background on the project, how this project has been guided by past plans and community inputs, the key barriers to housing production discussed in the audit that was completed earlier this year, and how the impacts to current regulations of housing in these districts. Next, we'll go over the key issues and priorities to get a sense of what you care about when it comes to considering expanding housing in the commercial and mixed use districts. And then finally, we'll go over the continuum of approaches to remove those barriers to housing in Springfield. And we'll review the code concepts themselves. So, first part, a project overview. So, as many of you know, Springfield is growing. It is because that's why we're here today. As planners, our job is to plan for what's needed to support that growth in a way that reflects Springfield's values. That's why we're here to discuss and understand what residents and businesses prioritize when it comes to making it easier to build needed housing in our commercial and mixed use districts, while we're trying to balance the community's priorities. So far, this project has been guided by our past plans and community input. We have adopted plans and policies that guide where and how Springfield should grow based on these priorities. These include our comprehensive plan and neighborhood refinement plans. Other initiatives also explored ways Springfield could potentially change its planning framework for allowed uses and design standards. This project will build on that foundation by using the direction from those past efforts, along with the input that we're receiving today and all of the community events that we have scheduled now and into the rest of the year. And then we hope to update our code, better meet the housing needs. So Springfield has some unmet housing needs, and we don't have enough housing that people can afford. Our housing strategy found that too few homes are being built and that we need 470 new homes every year to meet the target set by the state. We've also found that many households struggle to afford housing, with 44% of renters and 24% of homeowners spending more than 30% of their income on housing, which essentially translates to them being cost burdens. So back in May, I took some of the findings that were completed by our consultant Cascadia partners for this project to our planning commission and city council. That audit found that housing as a standalone use is generally not allowed in most mixed use or commercial districts. That where mixed use development is allowed, it is often economically infeasible to build. That most development standards would allow for higher density housing, but adjustments are needed to the development code to allow additional height, setback, or lot coverage standards. And finally, they found that the design standards and regulations for how Springfield uses its land in the mixed use districts could be simpler and more streamlined. Remember, many of our mixed use code sections haven't been updated in many years. That's why we're trying to get to them now. As far as where we're at in this project, I know this is a lot of graphics, but you can kind of see right down the middle of the black line. We're about halfway through. The first phase of the project included the code audit that I mentioned on the previous slide. And that audit identified areas in our land use regulations that need to change to comply with the Oregon administrative rules and statutes that Laura Lynn mentioned when she was introducing the project. Those are usually like state laws to consider, especially when it comes to housing. The consultant also identified opportunities to update the code or replace code language that may discourage housing production through unreasonable cost or delay. And I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. The second phase of this project we are currently in, and that's the code concepts work. So you can see it, we are here. We hope the concepts will facilitate discussion and feedback from the community on the potential approaches. So concepts, they're just approaches to how we could encourage more housing in Springfield. And then the third phase is going to be the code and plan amendments. That's what we'll get into later this fall and into the winter, first part of next year. So based on the findings and feedback that we received from all of you and the community, survey, events, this event here, we'll then take those amendments forward with our consultant. We'll prepare draft amendments to the code and any adopted land use plans. And we'll see how it goes next year for getting those things adopted. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more about the key issues and priorities of this project. So, what are the key priorities? When you think about ways being easier to build in our mixed use and commercial districts, what are your key priorities? On the screen, there are 4 options. These include economic development, context sensitive design, strategic growth, and build homes faster. These priorities often overlap. You can see that maybe a priority might be context sensitive design, but we want to be considerate about the strategic growth, where it happens, what it looks like. And so That's why we want to hear from you, and we want to hear what's important to the community when it comes to meeting these priorities. So the first option, economic development. If this is your priority, your perspective might be: one, preserve enough land for future employment growth to meet the state's planning goals. Two, you could just care about keeping the areas already zoned for commercial uses focused on employment rather than housing. And three, acknowledge that some types of businesses like auto repair, distribution, or manufacturing aren't really compatible with housing. So again, in an economic development perspective, you want the focus to be on employment needs, not necessarily housing. The next option is context-sensitive design. If your perspective is this, one, you might be looking for where taller or more intense housing is allowed, it should transition in height and scale to match the adjacent homes and neighborhoods. So for instance, if the maximum height is 35 feet, the new proposed building could also be 35 feet. We're matching the scale, the height of the abutting neighborhood or development. Two, when new development shouldn't take away from the character of commercial areas. To do this, we would require active storefronts that front on the street. So still a commercial use when you are abutting a street or frontage. And then three, housing along busier streets needs to be developed in a way that ensures safety and livability for residents. Think about landscaping, sidewalks, things that make the street frontage more attractive for pedestrians and storefronts. Walkability is usually what we consider when we consider context-sensitive design. The next priority is strategic growth. If this is your perspective, it might be one, to encourage more housing in areas where people can walk, bike, or take transit to meet their daily needs. Two, you'll support growth in places that already have or are planned to have infrastructure and amenities. Think about areas that are zoned for higher density housing. Those would be the areas where we would focus development. And then three, piggybacking off that, we would allow higher density housing and mixed use buildings so more people can live close to amenities and services. I know for myself personally, when I'm looking for housing, I like to think about, can I walk to a grocery store from my house? How far away would that walk be? And is it safe for me to be able to walk to that location? And then the last priority. If this is your perspective to build homes faster, the number one would be to increase the overall supply of housing to meet demand. Two, new housing should be allowed wherever it can be built feasibly and efficiently. And three, the flexibility in location, design, and zoning is critical to speed up production. So again, we're just focused on housing for this one. Our priority is to build housing more than what we probably would with an economic development perspective, where we want the focus to be on employment needs. The focus here is on building more housing. All right, some discussion questions. So here's where I want to hear from you. Feel free to raise your hands or I'm going to read the questions on the screen and then next. So the first overall impression, what key position? Sorry.
Take a break.
Yeah, obviously, I have a microphone to my hands. What key position or priorities resonate with you and why? What challenges or opportunities do you see if housing is added in places that currently have a predominant commercial use? And three, are there places that you believe are best suited for housing growth based on what you know of Springfield? So I'm gonna actually go back to the slides so you can see the different priorities all on the same slide. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the changes that the legislature made in the last couple of sessions on middle housing? And I think the last one they did one on housing that said you can cite a house residence in any zone.
So I don't know if I could touch on middle housing to that perspective. I could touch on income qualified housing. In areas, not every zone, so we would allow income qualified housing, which typically, looks like affordable housing, but there's a balance, there's an affordability period, and income qualified, parameters that you have to meet. It's based off of an average median income of the county. So like in Lane County, it could be based off of a family of 4. What's the average median income of that family of 4? And then it would be a percentage of that income. That would be what we would qualify as income qualified housing. So if it was 60% of the area median income, that's what we would kind of consider as income qualified housing. And we would allow more housing in areas that are not residential. So we could allow it in a commercial district. We could allow it potentially in an industrial district, subject to some standards. But if you're asking about middle housing, I don't really have enough information right now about what happened in the most recent legislative session. Sandy, do you have anything you want to add about it? If you know.
Well, I mean, in short, middle housing is basically saying that we have to allow what's called middle housing, which are duplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters and townhomes. Anywhere we would allow a single unit residential dwelling, a detached dwelling. So we've already incorporated that into our code. And this current project is really focused on the mixed use areas, which in mixed use context, we're talking multiple unit housing. We're not really talking middle or single unit housing. For the most part, I'm not saying that that's exclusive, but that's the predominant focus is the multi-unit housing that we would consider in mixed use and commercial use. Have I answered your question?
I think so. I was kind of under the impression that the combined pieces over the last couple of sessions, which were intended by the government and legislature to make it more possible to build housing anywhere, they hit that supply number, so maybe it's more restricted in that.
Well, I mean, in addition to the income qualified housing that Haley talked about in commercial districts, the legislature also passed a bill to allow any commercial building that's already there to convert to housing. And so we're already with the income qualified housing and allowing existing commercial to convert to residential, we're already opening up commercial districts to housing. And the question is, do we want to allow standalone market rate housing in some of those commercial districts? Is kind of the big question for you today. And if so, how and where?
It's complicated. This is a complicated subject. So it's okay to have lots of questions, yes.
So I have a question. I'm trying to understand. So what do you know now? What do you think the opportunity might be to making these changes versus what's already allowed from the housing? Because obviously we need more housing.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand in the city, are you far enough along to know what additional opportunities for housing development might exist within these categories?
Yeah, absolutely. I get into that in the next part of the
Okay.
presentation, which is about the concepts themselves, what concepts I can present to you and show you kind of what we've been working on. So I promise we're getting into it. Yes.
Haley, are there, what are the parking requirements for this type of housing? Is there the parking requirements for the existing commercial neighborhoods? And, are there any potential conflicts there?
Yeah, so we'll get into this soon in the presentation, but one of the projects we're also working on is the climate friendly equitable communities. And in particular, the climate friendly areas project, which is also centered on our mixed use districts. But part of that project to comply with climate friendly and equitable communities was to address our parking requirements. I believe we did it last year or maybe the year before, a couple years ago. So yeah, a couple years ago where we actually no longer require parking. It is still, at the property owner's discretion if they want to put in parking, but it's no longer a requirement. throughout the city. So it's completely optional if that's what they want to develop in. But yeah, maybe if you decided to build in a commercial area where there already is parking, something less you have to consider. A benefit. Thank you, Tom. Yes.
I have a question or kind of comment. My name is Stephen Wild. I'm with Boston Shed LLC. We are in the process of purchasing part of the Mohawk Shopping Center to construct a 550 unit mixed use income qualified multifamily community housing. And this that incorporates green space, urban forest, spaces for economic growth and education for kids coming out of the schools. They're as part of high schools or our involvement with universities to provide training and education in innovative construction technologies. We use volumetric, prefab modular. So take out all of the process of everything. We can produce our units in under 6 months, and it takes 60 days to assemble them all. One of the things that I really appreciate that you addressed it earlier is understanding code and how we work within that code. Because our development model actually exceeds the immediate housing needs of Springfield with one development. Who are the best people to be engaged with in navigating the process? I know I heard, I know there's been a big focus on the industry. I really appreciated Commissioner Chair Buck bringing up the work session Thursday, next Friday. Are there other areas that we could be looking at? We identified a few years ago, Mohawk Shopping Center really needs something. It's the perfect site for walkability because we've got schools right there, you've got shopping, we're working with LPE, they're changing their transportation routes to accommodate residents, which speaks to what you were saying about, what you were asking about parking. It's really a transit pedestrian oriented design. How do we, in moving forward, it's been very challenging in understanding. My eyes have been like trying to understand, going through the code, and our architects and engineers involved in reading through the code. How do we best engage with the city of Springfield in bringing this to life, particularly when it comes to height requirements, because the residential units to the east are generally one story. And we're looking at a range, we're looking at 5 buildings, and we're looking at a range of height for each building. Is there anything in the code that we can use to work with? Essentially, like, I've grown up in Lane County, Springfield's where I spent a lot of my time. We're watching the needs. Who are the best people to have in dialogue with us outside of like state agencies that are like, yeah, that's where we do this, and we can see Springfield as the spot to really demonstrate how this model works.
You couldn't have asked for a better person. So I mentioned that I handled the code amendment process for income qualified housing last year. So we did amend our code to comply with state law. That was a bill that was passed the year before for income qualified housing. But one of the benefits of income qualified housing, a state requirement, is that we have to allow increased density and height. So that is actually in our code. And then a benefit to building income qualified housing is that the state also passed legislation that says that we have to allow some adjustments as long as it meets those income qualified housing thresholds. For certain heights, setback, lot coverage standards. I believe it's Senate Bill 1537. You can look up the application on our website. So that, it's a great benefit. I hope more, affordable housing developers will look at that opportunity and consider that flexibility, but I'm always willing to hear and interested in the development community's perspective on what could be limiting development. I understand it's very complicated. That's why I have kind of a full-time employment job. And so that's what we're hoping to work on with this project, is to make it easier for the development community to understand, have some flexibility in the standards, and then if you have feedback or questions, come to me. We can look into them and try to address them.
Okay, I think I've emailed you a couple times,
Okay.
so I will expect an email from you.
Okay, yeah, and if not, it's just H Campbell, so Campbell like the soup, at Springfield-or.gov. So I'm happy to answer them. And then if you're particularly interested in income qualified housing or affordable housing, our community development block grant
That's what
program,
we're doing. Yeah.
they also, you might have been talking to some of my coworkers about that. So I'm in the department footstep. So if it's just about the code, I'd be the person to ask for those questions.
Okay, yeah, our biggest issue is like. And as I'm sure all of you know, you're in development, sometimes it feels like you're herding cats. So like, getting everyone that needs to be at the table at the same time, is a challenge, so. That would be helpful also. When I do not know, I'll ask you.
Great. All right, any other questions before I move on? I'm sure you guys want to hear about the code concepts. No, okay, hearing none, awesome. All right, so now we're going to actually look at the code concepts and hear your perspectives. So Cascadia Partners, our consultant that we're working on with this project, found 6 potential code concepts to address. But today I'm just gonna be addressing 2 of them. And the first 2 are expanding opportunities for housing in our commercial districts and then reducing barriers to housing in our mixed use districts. So commercial, mixed use. The 4 other concepts will be explored and available for review in the fall when the concepts are finalized. So right now we're just in the draft, we're getting your feedback. Any feedback that we receive and changes we need to make will happen the rest of the summer into the fall, and a finalized draft will be available for the public this fall. Yeah. Okay, so why are we considering the commercial and mixed use districts? These areas are already planned for shops, businesses, and a mix of uses. Some of these areas already even have housing. If you've driven down Main Street, you might see some of them. They can be mixed use buildings or standalone housing development. Some of those older development already exist. So that makes them logical places to consider adding more housing near existing jobs and services without major changes to Springfield's uses. So our current regulations, I talked about, can be a little restrictive and can have some barriers to housing. So I just wanted to go over them briefly on the screen to give you guys a little bit more perspective of kind of what we're dealing with. So on the left-hand side, you can see our existing residential districts, and these are the most flexible for housing. Makes sense, right? When we consider a residential district or a residential use, we might consider a single family dwelling, those middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and then multifamily. That's usually where we allow housing standalone as a use. And then on the right, we have existing commercial districts and industrial districts. Generally, we don't allow housing in those districts. And then in the middle, that leaves where we could have a little bit of flexibility, at least right now. So these are our mixed use residential, our mixed use commercial, and our mixed use employment districts. We have those 3 mixed use districts. Then we have the Glenwood mixed use district. We're sitting in one right now. And then our Booth Kelly mixed use district, which is in downtown, just on the other side of the railroad tracks. So, piggybacking on that continuum that you just saw, here's some potential approaches to remove barriers to housing. And as we pointed out earlier, we have the left-hand side where we allow residential, the right-hand side where we have, commercial and industrial, where generally we don't allow housing. And then in the middle is our flexibility, those pieces that are colored. So for the climate-friendly areas, that's the one with dark blue at the top. We're exploring opportunities to allow housing either as a standalone use or as part of a mixed-use development. And Monica will touch on that, in the slide. And then in keeping in line with this concept, we could explore more options for community commercial along Main Street. So I'll get into that after Monica presents a little bit. And then the other options for consideration in orange and turquoise are to make mixed use development more feasible. So we'll get into that, what that looks like as far as flexing the standards a little bit for development. And then allow mixed use development in neighborhood commercial districts throughout the city. And again, I'll get into that in a couple more slides. So I'm gonna have Monica jump in and present a little bit.
We realize the city has several efforts occurring, not just to comply with state mandates, but to address our housing shortage. And recognizing that, we want to do our best to clarify how these various efforts differ, but also how they relate so they can be mutually supportive. And as Haley noted, one other concurrent effort going on are the climate friendly areas. I'll just say phase for short from here on out. I recognize some of you from last year's City Club around this time last year where I presented on that. So it's good to see you again. And just a little bit of an update on where we're at and refresher. CFAs allow for a variety of housing choices like apartments, townhomes, mixed-use buildings in places that are close to jobs, services, amenities, and transportation options. So an update, February 2025, council selected 3 preferred CFAs to designate Glenwood Riverfront as a primary CFA, which has higher densities and allowed heights as compared to the Mohawk and downtown secondary CFAs. These 3 areas rose to the top due to existing allowances for a mix of uses, so not much of a departure from what Springfield's already done. And they also clearly had proximity to walking, biking, other amenities, so it aligned really well with what the state was requiring. The team is currently drafting amendments to the Springfield Development Code and comprehensive plans to implement CFAs. We'll have one more opportunity for public input in that process to come as part of the adoption process, and we anticipate that to be later this year. And you'll see on other maps for this project where those proposed CFAs are and where they might overlap to what the Housing and Design Initiative effort is exploring. I think that would help guide thinking and discussions as they move forward with housing and design. And I think that just the next couple slides here, it might also help to understand the development framework for CFAs and put into context what this project might also do as far as like design development requirements. So I'll touch on those briefly. In the Glenwood Riverfront, that's the primary CFA. We chose that as primary in that looking at before the state requirements came online, the code already allowed for high density residential uses, 50 dwelling units per acre, and didn't allow and won't allow a maximum building height to encourage more housing development. So a lot of similar visions already adopted. The proposed CFA changes in Glenwood are intended to increase flexibility to allow standalone housing, commercial or mixed use buildings within the riverfront area. And that very much aligns and is consistent with the approach for the Glenwood Master Plan site. Before the changes were drafted, some of the detailed land use districts or zones, Glenwood office mixed use or commercial mixed use, had very specific limitations, and the CFA process will back out of some of those for more flexibility as well. And then moving on to secondary. For downtown and Mohawk, we're requiring a minimum density of 15 dwelling units per acre, but not requiring a maximum density. And that's a result of state law compliance. We're also thinking holistically and proactively, however, about how to sync up with our concepts that the housing and design effort is exploring. So some updates with that, these CFAs will require housing or propose to require housing. To be part of a mixed use development along the busier streets, the arterials as we call them, so Mohawk being one. Downtown and Mohawk. I would say if we're looking at downtown, the busier streets will be Main Street, South Bay, Pioneer Parkway, even Centennial, touching Mohawk. So think of, I'm going along and there will be housing that I see, or can get to if you know somebody that lives there yourself, making it convenient, hopefully safer. For properties not along those busy streets and those secondary CFAs, we can just allow standalone housing, and then for commercial uses throughout the CFAs, those can be mixed use or standalone. So you're seeing a lot more flexibility, I'd say, instead of restricted this.
Monica? And can we go back one slide? I think along the arterial streets, I might, clarify there that we would allow fully commercial, but if there was gonna be a mix, to allow housing, you have to have the commercial on the ground. So I don't think we would require along arterial, we wouldn't require the housing. But if there is housing, it would have to be commercial on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna follow up with Chelsea too. She's managing that project. I want to get that. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
The 15-unit minimum, how does that relate in the downtown area where we've seen some of the older buildings and converted stores now? There clearly isn't 15 units in each of those projects. So how do you apply that?
Currently, with the latest projects, since the requirements aren't adopted yet, that wasn't in place, so, they got in time in that regard, and then. I think, how the 15 dwelling units would play out as far as height, I can't, predict, but we estimate about 4 stories, and so looking at what we have now, 2 stories. A little bit higher, potentially, knowing that's also historic area, we want it to be more sensitive to not going up to 85 feet.
So if somebody wanted to take like the old antique stores that were the dime stores next to the Wildish in there and wanted to convert the second story of that to apartments, keep commercial on the bottom, they couldn't get 15 units. Does that mean they would have to go higher?
Yes, the minimum density is a requirement.
So essentially, you're saying they'd have to find a way to build onto it or knock it down and build new. Ooh.
On a follow-up on that, Monica, is that, was the state mandated, or is that, so that's the default requirement from the CFA? Well, that's interesting.
We have, and I thought that might come up as far as, detailed questions of feasibility if people really want to understand. So there is a handout that talks about not just how this relates, but what CFAs are looking at, just to let that sit, and in case you want to follow that adoption process, because that's later this year, so I want to make sure that.
Just a follow-up clarifying question, so it makes sense to me, you're developing an acre, you need to have 2 units per acre. But if you're not developing a full acre, you're developing a single building. How does that scale down to a single building?
That was my
That's a
question.
great question. I want to get back to you on that.
Well,
Yeah.
It would just, you would just calculate the percentage, so if you're half an acre, then you do some, and half the quarter acre, you do the scale.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you looked at some? Will that effectively preclude redevelopment of some of the older buildings in the downtown?
Well, yeah, so these are for climate friendly areas, we're meeting state requirements. And that is one of the reasons why we made downtown a secondary area rather than being a primary, because
Oh, so it doesn't apply to the downtown.
it does, but it's 15, whereas the primary is higher. It's a higher minimum density, And so we didn't want to have that higher density like we would for a primary C of A in downtown. Because it would do more to preclude redevelopment, even though I think the 15 units actually will preclude some, but not as much. So that's why council went, even though conceptually you think of downtown as your primary area, we made it a secondary climate friendly area because we didn't want to preclude too much of the new redevelopment opportunities.
So,
I'm kind of piggybacking on what Sandy and the gentleman that they were saying. Looking at what has gone on with the redevelopment in downtown along Main Street, it's been phenomenal in increasing walkability, the restaurant. It's just an absolutely fantastic place. To get around and the decrease in traffic speed makes it feel safer. Is
yeah.
in thinking about Mohawk in our project specifically, and we mentioned of commercial, how is like, what is the definition, or are there differences between definitions in commercial versus retail? Also, yes, excuse me, this is the second part of the question. Does Springfield have the capability to increase speeds along those roads that would be like frontage, so that it does feel safer for pedestrians and walkability to accessing those retail, like restaurant sites or something along the street front? Not too much that I.
You're fine. I understand it all, it's just, I wanna get you the best, most accurate answer, so I know transportation has various ways to improve safety. I do believe we have jurisdiction, but sometimes we have to think about, is that a state facility or? So I think follow up on that one, and then, to your first point, retail is often a subset of what we think of as commercial, so, commercial being broad and then specific activities, retail being one, or I would say a shop or a restaurant, shopping, restaurant. Other services, but I do think that look at the code would help you see that. But
Okay.
yeah, sounds like a lot of good follow-up though, and I do like that you coordinated with LTD and have thought about other transit options too. I was meeting in the islands at one point, like 20 years ago, as part of the ops team, like, wow, this is. So anyway, I think I'm gonna keep us moving, but follow up on different ways to increase safety, I'd say.
And because I know you want to get back to my concepts, right? So now we're gonna move on to the concepts for the other areas, those commercial districts, and then again, we'll get to the end, we'll talk more about the mixed use districts. But as far, I do want to piggyback on like Mohawk and downtown, those arterial streets, right? If you think about it, those are usually busier streets, right? Main Street is an arterial street, so you're seeing a lot more traffic. That's why we are considering, especially in downtown and Mohawk, retaining the ground floor commercial requirement in those areas. You're seeing a lot more foot traffic, a lot more walkability in those areas, not necessarily an area where we want to encourage housing for sure on the ground floor. Kind of want to slow it down and have more pedestrian walkability in those areas. And we also will look at uses as part of this project too. Because it's so complicated in the code. There's a lot of different uses, especially in mixed use. Okay, so on to the neighborhood commercial districts. I apologize for that this time, but if you guys have questions, there's handouts. So the first concept is to allow mixed use development in the neighborhood commercial district. And again, I apologize, the map is kind of hard to see, but it's spread out throughout the city. And its purpose is to provide opportunities for day-to-day commercial needs. So think of this like your convenience store, your coffee shop, your small business. Mill Street is a great example. There's like a yarn store and a dentist office and a convenience store all within that block. There's quite a few neighborhood commercial properties, but spread out throughout the city is what you'll see. This concept would look at allowing housing above an existing commercial development. Or behind it, but consider this to be a mix of uses. So. Standalone housing developments would not be allowed, so again, it has to be a mix of uses, housing above a commercial use or housing behind an existing commercial use. But not just housing, because we want to retain that commercial use in that neighborhood for walkability purposes. So one restriction that we could place on this type of development from a design perspective is to limit the height. So that the building could be no taller than the maximum height allowed in the abutting residential district, right? So if a residential district's max height is 35 feet, the maximum in this situation would also be 35 feet. Okay, on to the Main Street corridor. So you might be asking, why are we looking at Main Street? The first is that housing is already permitted in some specific areas, like our mixed use designated areas, which I'll get into in the next slide. There are previous plans. This is a plan here on the screen. And concepts where we established a desire for more housing in certain areas along Main, like our Main Street corridor vision plan. There's more of an opportunity for development along Main Street, especially if you've ever driven down Main Street, you might see some vacant or redevelopable parcels, vacant storefronts, or just lots that haven't been developed. So those areas you might not see in other areas of the city. But we also have to still take into consideration that we can't place too much pressure on our employment land. We still need to preserve some of our employment land for commercial or industrial uses. So that's what we're trying to kind of balance as part of this project. If we allow housing, how do we make sure that we still have enough commercial and employment land for those needs for the future? So the first concepts, where we're allowing housing on Main Streets. This option is the most flexible. So you can kind of see it at the top. That's that range of housing options from the most flexible to the most restrictive, from the left to the right. So it's kind of like, again, in that middle of allowing housing on sites that meet certain criteria. So in this instance, the housing would be allowed on arterial streets. So I said that Main Street was an arterial street and 42nd is also an arterial street. It would allow standalone or mixed use as long as the property is under an acre. Commercial uses would also be allowed. So I'm not saying that you can't have commercial. It can be commercial, it can be standalone housing, or it can be mixed use. You could have ground floor commercial, residential above. You could have commercial in front, residential behind, as long as the property is under an acre. Anything over an acre, we're still retaining that commercial requirement. So it still continues to be commercial uses. This works because we already allow some existing standalone and mixed use housing along Main Street. I know if you guys have driven down Main Street, you will see it. Little pockets here and there of some housing that already exists, or we have commercial and residential apartments above an existing use. You'll also see it kind of in blue. It's a little hard to see on the map, but between 42nd and 48th, around that area, that's an existing mixed use district. So again, we allow some standalone housing there. It could be a mix of uses. It already exists. That's from our East Main refinement plan. Again, but to preserve that employment land, we're limiting those new uses to certain areas and site sizes. Our commercial, industrial, and buildable lands inventory, so that's the inventory we have to put together to make sure that we have enough employment land for 20 years. Found that overall we had a surplus of commercial and mixed use properties under an acre. So we have more properties than we necessarily need for commercial and industrial under an acre. We need more when it comes to over an acre. The second concept for Main Street would allow more housing in certain mixed use areas. Again, but it's slightly more limiting than the first. So I just talked about on the previous slide, in the East Main refinement plan between 42nd and 48th, that's an existing mixed use area. So we already allow a mix of uses in that area. So that is one area that we're just kind of going to loosen up the standards just a little bit for how much housing, how much commercial, things like that. And then I talked about on one of the previous slides, there was a Main Street corridor vision plan, and that showed a proposed mixed use area between 14th and 23rd. Where you, again, you could have a mix of uses, mixed use commercial, mixed use employment, things like that. If you think about it, again, if you're driving down Main Street, where does the traffic usually slow down? It's around 20th Street, where it goes from a 5-lane highway back down to 2 lanes. So again, more foot traffic, slower speeds. We go from around 35 down to 30 and eventually into 20. So that is a kind of a prime target for more housing, just from that perspective of there's more pedestrian traffic, less high speed traffic in general. So inside these areas, again, we could allow standalone housing, we could allow mixed use housing, and we can continue to allow commercial. Outside these areas, so in the middle of Main Street, it will continue to be a commercial use. So we're just focusing on those 2 areas in particular. Slightly more limiting than the first, where we said all of Main Street under an acre. This one is just in those areas. And then the most limiting of the options, this would be, again, where we would allow more housing, but in mixed use centers. So previously, you might have heard of the term nodal development or transit oriented development. That was a big thing for transportation a few years ago. They tried to emphasize that certain areas had a mix of uses. And they also incorporated part of that into our vision plans, our concepts. So in this instance, for the Main Street Corridor Vision Plan, they identified 3 key intersections, the 21st Street, 30th Street, and 32nd Street, as areas where we could allow, again, those mix of uses. You're thinking those key intersections. I don't know if you've driven again down Main Street, but on 30th, 32nd, we just got a lot developed with a new coffee shop and car wash. So think of that as a key pedestrian intersection where you can see more uses. A little bit more limiting though, because you're thinking about, are there any blocks in those areas where we could or want to see more redevelopment opportunities? Some of those intersections are maybe already developed, so you have to think about it from that perspective. Again, we'll allow standalone, we'll allow mixed use, and we'll continue to allow commercial. Anywhere outside of that continues to be commercial. All right, so on to the concepts and some discussion. So for the neighborhood commercial, do you support exploring the proposed change to allow mixed use buildings in the neighborhood commercial district? Do you have any concerns about this? So think about it from the perspective of, I want to build a mixed use development building somewhere in a neighborhood to provide services to the residents that live in this neighborhood, and I want them to be able to walk to this service. I want to provide a coffee shop, convenience store, or a small business. Think about it from that perspective, and we'd allow that around the city. We would not allow it as standalone housing. It still has to have some sort of commercial and some sort of housing use. And then on Main Street, which, if any of the alternatives do you support for allowing housing on Main Street? Do you think the development code should be more or less flexible than today with regards to housing on Main Street? So someone mentioned earlier that we did take these concepts to our governance committee last Thursday, and we did get more feedback that they do want more flexibility when it comes to this, but we are also here asking the community for feedback on what they want as well. Questions? I can go back to the last two.
I'll throw out a question. In evaluating all of these, how do you take into account the fact that commercial development is a net generator of tax revenue and residential development is a net user of tax revenue? How does that factor into all of these?
Yeah, I think that's something that we'll look at as we try to produce more findings. I think that's what we're kind of trying to balance right now and make sure that we're not taking away too much employment land. I think I mentioned earlier that essentially what we found is we have a surplus of those properties under an acre. And then again, the state is pointing to, for income qualified housing in particular, you have to allow it. You have to allow housing in these areas. So I could have a developer come in and say, hey, here's a property under an acre, or anywhere in particular, as long as it meets income qualified housing thresholds. I want to develop this commercial property for housing, and we, the city, cannot say no. So it's that balancing act. as long as we have that surplus of lands, it's opening up that opportunity for development. We just have to make sure that we're not going into a deficit then. Most flexible, anything under an acre. Little bit more flexibility just in certain areas. And the most restrictive, just at key intersections. So if I was thinking about it from an intersection perspective, I might be a little concerned with traffic. Wanting to make sure that this is safe for pedestrians if they want to cross that street to be able to access those amenities and services. And then also consider, is there any redevelopable or vacant parcels at these intersections? Am I gonna want to redevelop property on these intersections? Things like that.
Oh, good.
I think if we want more time to read, sit with it, look at maps, I mention the survey will be out in the next couple weeks, we'll have it open. At least through August, part of September, so more time with that as well, to provide feedback.
We have handouts and there's also business cards, so you guys can reach out to me with any questions, phone call, email.
So I just have a timing question, and I appreciate all this effort, and I tend to be one of those that want to be more flexible in a lot of different ways, because I think that will help. But I'm trying to understand, you started off with this needing 470 new housing units a year. And that we're not even through this process. Well, how does any of this lead us to more quickly getting housing built that we need, especially in the price ranges, or are we gonna?
Yeah.
I mean, that's my question.
Yeah, I would say that being able to purchase a property that is already developed and build what you want to develop on that property cuts down the cost. So we'll go into this in a little bit, but like building mixed use development in general, it can be cost prohibitive, right? To get financing where you have to have a commercial ground floor requirement and then build residential above. That can limit the amount of funding that you can get for that development. As opposed to, I just want to build affordable housing, or I want to take a commercial development that's already there and build on top of it.
That makes sense.
It's gonna be a little bit more flexible.
Sure.
What sort of area of this project is coordinating with the Springfield Utility Board to be able to provide water in particular? I know, electricity is probably a little bit easier. The city controls sanitary and stormwater, so. Is the sub on board here?
We'll be reaching out to them to make sure we get their feedback on these areas too, and that they can provide that infrastructure, because I know that was also a concern, especially for our existing mixed use areas. Is infrastructure available, improvements, how much does that cost of that, things like that.
Have you guys looked at their long range plan?
Something that we're working on now. Right now, it's just concepts, so, yeah. Just making sure that we have kind of the feedback and okay that we want to move ahead with this process before we get too far along.
I can kind of answer that, because we've had a lot of conversations with stuff. They're very supportive overall, the forward progress in development of Springfield and assisting developers in utilizing and expanding infrastructure that exists and working with them to be involved with the yeah.
The housing itself.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for attending today, the great questions. Thank Haley and Monica for presenting. We're at 101. If you do have some additional questions, I'm sure Haley and Monica will stay a couple extra minutes to answer those. But we really appreciate everybody being here. The next presentation is on August 21st. Did I get that date right, Lynn? Yes, and it will be Mayor Sean Van Gordon talking about his fiscal task force and some of the recommendations and information on that topic. We will be presenting, some of the findings from the task force and some other information. Lynn will be getting that on the website here shortly. Again, we'll notify you through e-updates if you're interested in coming on to that meeting. And if you're not on our e-list, please sign up on the green sheets on the table and we'll get you on there. So thanks again, everybody.
Sixteen years on a fine. I started, never.
Yeah.
We were separated.
Yeah, no, that's-
Back the whole problem, so bad you can't have that